And I'm the president of Penn San Miguel. I want to welcome all of you here. I want to thank those who come very frequently and thank those who are here for the first time. This Penn in San Miguel is an English language group, and there are 3 Penn centers in Mexico. One is in Guadalajara, one is in Mexico City, and then there is us. We, as you may know, I think, work very hard to support the idea of freedom of expression, not only the idea of freedom of expression, but the freedom of expression. And so all of the funds that come from you at this event go towards supporting writers who are having difficulty in their particular countries. We are part of a worldwide organization, PEN International, and in fact, our vice president, Lucina Kathman, is an international vice president, and we also have the head of the Women's Writers Committee, Marion Butts Fraser, who's here today. We're very glad to have her here, and we also want to invite you in a social way to join the speaker afterwards and come to Vivali, which is the restaurant right across the street, to have dinner, and then you will be given a free glass of wine. So our situation is one of thinking about how do we most advance the agenda of freedom of expression, and people have all kinds of ideas about it, but our speakers are the ones that, in fact, give us the best types of ideas. We've had a very, very fortunate occasion to have Elizabeth Rosner because our speaker, Deb Stein, had to cancel. And I'd like to just remind you that the next PEN talk will be on the 17th, because everybody that's in this room will be at the Writers' Conference, of course. So, and we will have a change there too. We've had a lot of A people today, A meaning their name starts with A. Instead of Alberto Avelera, we're going to have Alfred Coffey, who will talk about Cañada de la Virgen and various anthropological and archaeological things. So once again, thank you very much. Please, afterwards, Elizabeth will be selling her books, and we hope you will support her and PEN in that way. Thank you. I'm supposed to say Pat Herschel and introduce Elizabeth.
Funny sitting down here, but never mind. Thank you so much for coming, and I too am delighted to be introducing Liz, because I was the person who had to get somebody after Deb's husband unfortunately fell and broke his kneecap on our streets, and they had to go back to Chicago, poor things. And just luckily, my friend and Liz's mutual friend, Joe Nagel, said to me, "Oh, you're looking for somebody? Liz Rosner's going to be in town. She's coming on the 2nd. I said, "Gee, the talk is on the 3rd. What do you think?" And Liz did get in late last night. And the first minute that I emailed her, she returned the email and said, "I'd be glad to." Hallelujah. And then, because I hadn't caught up with her recent writings, I went online and began reading about this book, and I can't wait to read it. I had to keep myself from ordering it on Kindle because I want it signed in Liz's hand. Electric City sounds like a great book. It happened to have been named as one of the 10 best books of 2014 by the BCC Cultural Organization. So, without further ado, I give you Liz Rosner. Okay, so this was my idea. They were sitting side saddle, but I'm straddling the mic. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, my father wanted me to take a picture of the audience. So, smile. Thank you. He's here in spirit. He's in upstate New York, in Schenectady. Thank you, Penn, for inviting me. There are times when you don't want to be called in as the backup plan, but for Penn, it's a privilege and an honor to be asked to speak, so thank you for thinking of me, and thank you all for coming. And I'm so glad this place is restored. Last year, about this time, I think the ceiling had caved in, right? It's not going to cave in, don't worry. It's been reinforced thoroughly. So I am privileged to get to speak to you today about my work, and in thinking about Penn itself and the whole notion of freedom of expression, my own experience as a writer living in a country in which freedom of expression is presumably undeniable. I also can't help reflecting on my childhood and what it was like to grow up in a household where the notion of becoming a writer wasn't in any way a given, not because I didn't feel free exactly, but because the arts in general were seen as something other than self-maintaining, let's say. And although I know there are a lot of self-maintaining artists out there in the audience today, and I'm really grateful to say that I humbly place myself in that category now. I just want to read you the first few lines of a poem that is actually a dialogue I had with my father. You'll be hearing about him a lot tonight. The poem is called What Matters. You said it was no way to make a living. You loved books, but wanted me to use my hands. I wanted to make something out of nothing, out of air, words. Sorry, I'm going to be banging this. So first I forgot, I wanted to show you my, my glasses. Watch this. They're my Electric City glasses. In case there's a blackout, I can still read to you. So the reason I read you those first few lines of that poem is that some of you know a lot about my backstory because of my previous books, but I don't want to assume that people already know my biography. But both of my parents are Holocaust survivors, and my father was in a concentration camp at the age of 15. And that poem, in many ways, is actually a dialogue I had with him, both in reality and in my mind, in which I was constantly trying to understand his world and my world, given that I was born long after the war ended and grew up in a place far, far away from where all of that happened, and yet I understood that everything about him was essentially influenced by that experience, and yet I was trying to get him to also see me. So I wanted to see him, but I also wanted him to see me. And I understood that everything he had learned about survival made sense to him in a way that it didn't make sense to me. And our house was full of books, but the concept of being one of those people who wrote books somehow didn't make sense to him, and it made perfect sense to me. So my concept of home actually is rooted in language. And the idea that growing up in a small town in upstate New York, Schenectady, New York, seemed to me a bizarre distance from the places my parents had grown up, and yet their languages hovered all around that place all the time. And almost all of their friends also spoke languages other than English. So I was living in America, I was an American kid, but I didn't feel particularly American when I was inside my house. And so home was this murky territory that I was constantly navigating between the home that my parents had created in a way that they had invented. They had invented American versions of themselves. And yet this was the only home I knew, all the way interspersed with these images of places that I might have been born. So my father was born in Hamburg, Germany. My mother was born in Vilna, Lithuania. They met in Stockholm, Sweden after the war. They were refugees. They got married in Haifa in Israel. And then they came to America. After a few years of being in Newark, they went north to Schenectady when my father was hired by GE, referenced in Electric City by the name The Company. I'll get back to that in a minute. But so that was this chosen home for them. And yet, as I grew up hearing both the stories they told about their own childhoods and the stories they didn't tell about their childhoods, I found myself occasionally imagining who I might have been had I been born in Sweden, let's say, where they had met, or in Israel, where they were married, or even in New Jersey. But German was never spoken in the house, and Polish wasn't a language they shared. So Poland remained this very obscure, very shadowy place. Germany, of course, took on the specter of the place of the monsters. The monstrous language, the monstrous occurrences, the murder. And so I was supposed to be glad that I was born where I was, and I was supposed to embrace and love my home because it was their choice to be there. And yet, for me, it turned into a place that I wanted to get away from. I think in the article that Pat wrote in the Atención, I've been admitting publicly a lot lately that I couldn't get away from home fast enough. And there's another poem in Gravity, my little sales pitch for Gravity is, I call this the autobiographical companion to all of my novels. So there's a poem in Gravity called Keeping Kosher in the Philippines, which sounds like a joke, but actually it's true. So I graduated from high school when I was 16 in a big hurry to get away from home a year early, and I was selected for a scholarship by Rotary International. That was my first experience with a big international organization, and they sent me to the Philippines for a year. And after secretly looking at the globe to see exactly where the Philippines was located, after they told me that's where I was going, I realized it was exactly as far from home as I could get without leaving the planet. Perfect. So that's where I was from age 16 to 17. And the poem that begins with that line, when I was 16, I got as far from home as I could without leaving the planet, ends with the line, and what I discovered in that place so far from home is that I would always be my own country. So even at 17, I was starting to figure out a little bit about home not actually being a place. That home had more to do with a sense of self, a sense of self-invention, a sense of choosing, and it wasn't only a place that you were getting away from, but was actually a place you were reaching toward. And so after I came back from the Philippines, I went to college too close to home. Long story, but I ended up transferring to Stanford. I managed to get far again. I got to the edge of the continent. Another poem in Gravity references choosing to be on the coast farthest from the one my parents landed on. So again, I was still trying to negotiate how much distance was enough distance. And it was at Stanford that I started writing, even though I wasn't an English major. but I dabbled, let's say, in journalism. I studied international relations. And one of the things I discovered as I was studying international relations was that I was the product of an international relation. And that, in fact, that too was part of this self-definition process for me. What did it mean to be, you know how at some point in your life, maybe all of you did this in your childhood, you tried, let's see, I'm half this, but then, wait, I'm a quarter that, wait, I'm an eighth that, a 16th that. So as many descendants of survivors like myself, we don't necessarily know that much about our ancestors. A lot of that family story is abruptly cut off. But the little bits and pieces that I knew started to, there was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you know, what part of me was that? And then there was the Romanian grandfather whose citizenship actually enabled my father and his brothers not to be deported yet to a concentration camp. So there were all of these seemingly identifying markers telling me who I was, and yet I was in California, I was studying philosophy, economics, sociology, languages, and looking back over my shoulders was only part of how I was figuring out who I was. So writing actually became the act of naming myself. Except that when I went to graduate school, I studied fiction. And the process of naming oneself in fiction turns out to be quite different than in memoir, autobiography. And I thought, oh, when you write fiction, you have to write about things you make up, things you invent. So I started seeing writing as this almost battle of wills between the stories of my own I felt compelled to tell, the stories of my parents that kept pressing in on my, it wasn't just the back of my head, it was the front of my head, it was the sides, everywhere. And yet trying to figure out which of those stories belonged to me and which of those stories was I not supposed to tell because they were untellable, unspeakable. So my first novel, The Speed of Light, ends up being about the silences and the secrets inside families that can't be told. And I'll spare you the long story of my publication process, but the most bizarre thing happened. The first day of my book tour for The Speed of Light was September 11th, 2001. I was supposed to fly to a different city every day that week, starting that morning. And, you know, obviously, your response echoes the way I felt. It was shocking, stunning, devastating, and it took me months to realize this, but it very weirdly echoed all of my childhood in this way. My sadness was completely dwarfed by something so much bigger that had happened to so many other people than me. And so I had to kind of swallow that experience and say, well, you know, worse things happened, I'm okay, it's just a book. And really, I didn't even hear for months all the ways those were the sounds of my parents' voices basically telling me that nothing bad could ever happen to me because all the bad things had already happened. My taking the photo of the audience for my father has to do with an experience that happened when I started publishing poems. My parents were in the audience, and someone from the audience asked, what is it like to be writing about your family when your family can read your work? And I said, well, I think on the one hand, my parents are very proud that I'm writing and being read, and that I'm writing about them in a certain kind of way makes them feel seen, but I think it also might make them a little uncomfortable, but here they are, maybe they want to say something. And my mother shook her head, no, absolutely not. My father came up on stage, and he stood in the light,
and looked out at the audience, and he said, "Elizabeth's right, we're very proud of her, but I also have to say that it's really difficult for me ever to feel pure happiness because of all the millions of people that were killed." So, yes, that happened in the audience. And then he pulled a camera out of his pocket and said, "And now I'd like to take a picture of the audience." And so everybody was laughing and crying at the same time. And it turns out that's my definition of home also, to laugh and cry at the same time. That we're alive, we're here in America, we're free, we can say whatever we want, we can become, my father was constantly telling my sister, me, and my brother, even though he was far from a feminist, I assure you, he told me and my sister that we could be president. And that's what America meant to him, that you could not just feel safe and free, you could be anything except a writer. He's come around, he has come around. But so when I finished The Speed of Light, which took me 10 years and really did tell so many of the stories I had grown up with, and yet in a fictionalized way, I felt, maybe I'm done with this version of homecoming. I had a book contract for a second book, I'm gonna write something else. Lo and behold, there was a still other way of talking about home, the inside and the outside. And Blue Nude was my second novel, and I wrote a lot of that here in San Miguel, because it's about a painter and a model who poses for him, and the ways their histories collide when the model hears he's got a German accent, and he hears she's got an Israeli accent. Naked Israeli woman in a room with a German. That's the setup. But I learned so much about painting and the creative process here by watching painters paint, by modeling for some of them here, by interviewing painters, interviewing models. And yet, that book was not just a story about the creative process. As I've said, it was also the story of what happens when you meet the enemy, or the son of your enemy, and you look each other in the eye. Is it possible for you to humanize one another? Is it possible for you to see one another as an individual being, not the sum total of everyone you come from? So again, this notion of home, are you defined by who you come from, by where you come from, by the sound of your voice, by the words in your mouth? And that book became a story for me about how creativity can heal. Speed of Light was about telling the secret untold stories. Blue Nude was about using the creative process to open the wound and clean it out in a way, and then make it beautiful, make something beautiful out of the wound. So here we are, many years later now, and I'm sitting at a writer's conference, not the one in San Miguel, although I will be there next week. I'm sitting at a writer's conference, and someone's talking about the importance of place in writing. Not just the importance of place, but the necessity of place. And if you haven't seen the cover of the book, it looks like this. Hopefully you can see that even from far away. Light bulb on the cover. I don't know at what point the light bulb over one's head became the image of the bright idea, the new idea. We owe it all to Thomas Edison. But that happened for me listening to him talk about place, and I thought, I've written about storytelling, I've written about creativity, I've written about inherited grief, inherited trauma, but I haven't written about that place I ran from, Schenectady. By this time, my mother had already been dead for quite some years, but my father, still living in Schenectady, I thought, he's going to get a huge kick out of this. I'm going to write about Schenectady. He knows how much I wanted to get away. So I called him and said, I've decided that I'm going to set my next novel in Schenectady. And he started laughing, I knew he would, and then he said, you should write about Charles Steinmetz. I like that. It was one of those moments, right? Can I just ask quickly, has anyone who hasn't read the book, if you've read the book you already know who he is, but has anyone heard of Charles Proteus Steinmetz? One, two, almost nobody. Very few hands go up. So I went on an adventure to discover who he was. I had finally outgrown saying no as my first response to whatever my father suggested. And I thought, I'm going to check this guy out. There might be something interesting here. And here are some things I found out about him. He came to America from Bavaria and was almost turned away at, it wasn't Ellis Island at the time, it was about to become Ellis Island, for reasons of extreme deformity. He was 4 feet tall and he had a hunched back, and they almost sent him away. He turned out to be a genius mathematician, discovered by Thomas Edison, brought to Schenectady, and he became instrumental in really transforming the way we use electricity at that time. He also built himself a cabin on the edge of the Mohawk River in Schenectady and had a canoe, and he paddled up and down the river in his canoe performing calculations. Now, as a fiction writer, this made me quite envious. I thought, I could have made this guy up, but he's already real. You know, and so I did what any intelligent novelist would do. I just grabbed him out of the pages of the history books and said, he's mine now. And this image of someone, and there are photographs of him in his canoe, sitting with a board stretched across the canoe and papers kind of flying off into the wind, really captured my imagination. They used to call him the Wizard of Schenectady. And one of the things that gave him that nickname was he was the first one to create artificial lightning in the laboratory. So now, fast forward to somewhere in the 1990s, there's an organization in Schenectady calling itself the Edison Exploratorium. What they really wanted to call themselves was the Steinmetz Exploratorium, but not enough people had heard of Steinmetz, so they thought, we'll give it the Edison name, people will come. And they decided to name my father the next Wizard of Schenectady. So I have this, turns out, a very personal connection to this extremely eccentric figure who died in 1923, but not before really significantly changing the world, leaving his mark. So there was that piece that my father sent me to do. The other piece was, that's what I mentioned with these glasses, how many of you lived in the Northeast on November 9th, 1965? What happened? The great Northeast blackout of 1965. I'm guessing that several of you will come up to me afterwards to tell me where you were at the time that it happened. I was 5, and what I mostly remember are candles. But I decided that I wanted the book to move back and forth in time between the era of Steinmetz and the era of that blackout of 1965 and what came after, because even though I was too young really to remember it, it felt portentous to me to think about it, that there was something about the Schenectady I grew up in that was not the Schenectady of its heyday. GE, the company that only gets referred to as the company, went from employing 50,000 people to employing 5,000 people over the course of about a decade. They were turning the lights off in the town. They were not even sending jobs offshore yet. They were just sending jobs to other states where labor was cheaper and materials were cheaper. And what I was growing up in was a town that was going dim and dark. Downtown was becoming a ghost town. And even though everybody's father used to work for the company, people were moving away, stores were closing, people were going out of business. And I wanted to write about both the literal experience of that and the metaphor of that for an American town, to go from this thriving, booming promise to something that seemed a little scarier and sadder and less hopeful. By 8 years old, I was a feminist. By 11 years old, I was, marching for peace. I was really very aware of what was happening in the world, even though I felt quite powerless to do anything about it. But I wanted my characters to be more centered in that set of actions. And I also wanted to understand, what was it that had changed? What was it that had burned so brightly in the early days and that had started to turn itself off? And what might turn those lights back on again? What might bring, since all of my books ultimately are about hope, what would be a hopeful response to that darkness? So Electric City is the first novel that I really call my American book. It's kind of my biggest canvas, my biggest number of characters, my biggest stretch of time. But it also really is in many ways the long, long awaited love letter to this place I grew up in, that I rediscovered as a place of tremendous physical beauty and geological importance and significance. A really powerful Native American lineage. When I was growing up there, everything had an Indian name, but there were no Indians, I didn't think. I came to San Miguel the first time in the year 2000. There was a group of indigenous dancers in town on their way to Mexico City, and I met this guy. I was actually really attracted to him. Long black hair. He told me he was a Mohawk and that his family was from Schenectady. Which startled me on so many levels I can't even begin to tell you, but he was my age. We were contemporaries, and I had never known that was even possible. I thought the Native Americans had been erased, except for their names. So all the way back in 2000, you could say the seeds for this novel were planted here in this town. So that sent me spinning back to investigate. Everything else that wasn't named with an Indian name in Schenectady had the name Van something. Van Curler, Van Branken, Van Dyke, all of the Dutch names because of the Dutch colonial settlement there. And I wanted to know more about what that collision had been like, the Dutch and the Native Americans, not the way it had been told to me in school. When I met this guy here in San Miguel, he said, I bet you heard that the massacre, the big massacre, was the Indians killing the Dutch, right? And I felt so ashamed. It was true. That was how I had learned it. It was the other way around. So, geological layer, Native American layer, Dutch layer, all the way up to the Steinmetz layer, followed by the layer that really was my family story just after the war, the immigrants arriving with their American spirit. It was their new optimism. It was their belief in what was possible. So I'm going to leave you with just reading the first paragraph of the book. And then I think we should have time for questions, right? How am I doing with time? I have no idea. I've got time. Okay. All right, I'll read you 2 paragraphs then. Before the name Electric City, there were other names. And before those names, there were no names at all. The river carved itself into the valley, remembering everything. Pines thickened and pushed against the sky. Autumn went dark, then ghostly, freezing into the hibernation of winter. Spring resurrected the landscape and the creatures that filled it, painting the scenery back to life. Summers shimmered with wet heat until fall erupted into a riot. The story repeated and repeated, the same and yet not the same, year in and year out. The Hudson was known as the river that flows both ways, or Moheankatuk, and sometimes simply the river, as though the only one. Tributaries were referred to by their outer banks, shadowed by the trees best suited for canoe making. There was Shenatade, water beyond the pines, and also Andia Tarokte, or here the lake closes, later, much later, to be known as Lake George. Okay, doesn't that make you want to read the rest? So I just finished recording the book for audible.com, so the audiobook is going to be available, I think sometime in the next few weeks, I think by the end of this month. So that was another thrill that I had never experienced until this book. Reading my own words aloud, all of them, every single one. And that too turned out to be the sound of home in my mouth, the story of my place, the story of these names, that Shenatade became Schenectady, Andiatarokte became Adirondack, the sounds of these syllables weaving their way into our language. And now I can swim in Lake George and feel all that history in the quality of the water, in the silveriness of the water. I can take the train back to Schenectady, and guess what? The lights are coming back on. Proctor's Theater, which was in downtown Schenectady, it was an old vaudeville theater. Definitely went dark, started to put the lights back on. It turns out that urban planners have discovered, this is provable now, that if you resurrect an art space in the center of a burned out downtown, the whole town starts to re-emerge around it. That it's not about an employer, it's not about some high-tech thing, although those things are happening too in upstate New York. It's about having the creative centerpiece that people are drawn to, and then they want to eat dinner out before and after, and they want to spend the night in a hotel, and so Schenectady's lights are coming back on. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here. I'm really happy to take questions, and maybe if there's time I could read a little more, but maybe you guys wanted me to talk about something I haven't yet said, and I could go on and on for hours.